It's time for our weekly segment now, Korea Book Club, where we explore the world of Korean literature and books through notable recent works in Korean or in English translations. And to help us do that, we have joining us in the studio today cultural essayist Colin Marshall and host of the podcast Korea24. Colin, hello, it's great to see you again.
Glad to be here, Jang-ho.
Okay, so Colin, I'm understanding you have something a little bit different for us today. It's an English language book, a non-fiction work, in fact, and it's actually a new edition of a book about Korea that some of our listeners may actually already know, right?
It is, and more specifically, it's about Korean cool. That is to say, the cultural products that have won fans all over the world and built Korea this formidable arsenal of what's called soft power here in the first quarter of the 21st century. Now, it's telling that when Michael Breen, who's been a guest on this program, wrote his book The Koreans in the late 1990s, he didn't feel the need to cover popular culture at all. But less than 20 years later, Euny would write the first edition of The Birth of Korean Cool, a book about nothing but Korean popular culture. And that was published in 2014, which may sound recent enough, but if you compare it to this new expanded edition we're talking about today, came out just a couple months ago, you understand how much has changed since then.
Right, 2014, that is a long time ago indeed when you think about how the Hallyu wave has taken over the world really since then. 2014 was only 2 years after Psy swept the world with Gangnam Style, of course. It was before the mainstream success of K-pop artists and groups like BTS and Blackpink. Korean films had been drawing critical acclaim, but the viewership of Korean dramas hadn't really broken through beyond Asia that much. Korean food was, of course, becoming quite popular in a few countries as well. So at the time, Korea was certainly becoming cool, or at least a mainstream cool, but there must have been so much for Euny when it came time to put out a new edition of her book, I'm guessing.
Indeed, it may say it all when I tell you that the new chapters include one about Squid Game, one about Parasite, and one about BTS, neither of which were in the first book. BTS did exist 11 years ago, but they hadn't yet become this international phenomenon, hadn't broken the Billboard charts and all that.
Of course.
For most of the Westerners who were aware of it at the time, and there weren't all that many of them, Korean pop music was Gangnam Style. And, as Hong writes, when she was initially pitching The Birth of Korean Cool to publishers back then, she'd come up against this assumption that even that song's video had been artificially turned into a hit on YouTube by just buying massive amounts of views from overseas click farms. Not a substantiated story, but it was believed by some. So for those of us who were interested in Korean popular culture before the 2010s, it can all seem inevitable, in a way, that it became a global phenomenon. But even in 2014, there was a lot of doubt in the West about whether it could amount to anything more than just a sort of flash in the pan. So when the first edition of The Birth of Korean Cool may have sounded more tentative, at least in places, this new edition comes with a more triumphant tone. And in an epilogue titled K-Skeptics, eat their words, Hong even credits Korea with the achievement of what she calls perma-cool, the kind of near-invincible seeming level of soft power possessed by very few countries, the only other example she gives being France, where she's lived for a very long time, and on whose high-speed trains, by the way, even she was shocked to find bibimbap available for sale in the dining car.
Well, when this book was first published, it caught quite a lot of people's attention. We should get a clearer sense of the author's background. Most listeners who hear Euny name might assume that she's Korean. She is Korean, but as you said, she lives in France, and she wrote this book oriented towards a Western readership. It was originally written in English, right? Or was it translated?
Well, it's been translated into a host of other languages, which tells you something about the global popularity of Korea now. But she did originally write it in English, and a highly conversational English at that. I suspect it's been a success not just because it came out at the right time, when many Westerners were just about to get into Korean popular culture, but also thanks to its tone. There's a frankness and a humor not usually encountered in books of this kind. To my mind, reading it feels like talking to this wisecracking aunt who's had a few drinks and she's ready to speak her mind on a variety of subjects. To name a couple more chapter titles, there's K-Cinema, The Journey from Crap to Cannes. There's Samsung, the company formerly known as Samsung.
Wow,
these
okay.
two examples. This may not be the kind of book, not quite the book that official Korea, as I like to call it, would have commissioned to tell the country's story, but it's all the more enjoyable for that reason. But yes, Euny Hong is Korean, or rather a Korean-American born in New Jersey, whose family emigrated back to Korea in the mid-1980s when she was 12 years old. And the Korean government had lured back her father, who was a prominent economist, with promises of what would have been at least a better than upper middle class life at the time. And indeed, the family could install themselves in not just Gangnam, but Apgujeong, rent-free, in its best apartment complex. And young Euny, or here in her ancestral homeland, Yoongi, could go to the neighborhood's best school. But even there, she underwent a severe bout of what I'm not sure whether we can call reverse culture shock or not. Not least because even teachers at the fanciest Korean schools back then routinely dealt out corporal punishment for crimes like daring to bring a non-Korean-made mechanical pencil to class.
Wow, okay.
Those times, those days, that was the way. She also suffered linguistic difficulties, having mostly grown up in the U.S. in an era when many immigrant parents believed that children should learn only the language of the new country. So still, whatever the agonies of her neither here nor there formation, it did give her this insider-outsider perspective on Korea that placed her well to explain the country's modern cultural development to Westerners, or really any foreigners. And she stresses, here in The Birth of Korean Cool, that Korea wasn't always cool, to put it mildly, and uses her experiences as a young Korean American here to illustrate the ways in which it was, until quite recently, what she doesn't hesitate to call a third world country.
Yes, indeed. The story of the miracle on the Han River, as it's often called, I think people even passingly familiar with Korea will know something of how far the country's economy has come, even over just the past few decades, from a third world country, as she would put it. But how does Hong then account for that extra factor that she's covering, the newfound Korean cool of her book's title?
The Korean cool, as she sees it, Korea makes pop culture effectively, in something of the same way that it makes cars, washing machines, and televisions effectively. None of those products were considered good in the old days when Korea made them. Now they are. She does highlight the considerable state support provided to the culture industry, like to other industries here, which has resulted in her book sometimes being misinterpreted as an argument that the whole of Hallyu, or the Korean wave, is a government program, one big government program. She doesn't argue that.
Right.
But she does also point out that Korea tends to win by trying not to be first, but to be the best. So let other countries go through the trial and error of finding the right forms, developing them from scratch. And when they do, you master those forms and bring them into novel contexts and combinations. In the run-up to this presidential election, by the way, the candidates have spoken about how this country lives by exporting. And that's as true of the pop culture industry as it is in most others. As Hong points out, Korea has been wise not to obsess single-mindedly over breaking into the English-speaking West, but instead to drive resources toward promoting its media in Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and now even Africa. She doesn't mention this in the book, but I think you can gauge the influence of these efforts by the fact that last year saw the release of My Sunshine, a Nigerian movie modeled on Korean dramas set in a Korean school in Nigeria with an all-Nigerian Korean-speaking cast.
Yeah,
Korean-speaking to varying degrees.
That was quite an eye-catching series, to say the least.
Not long ago, I also happened to see a couple of music videos from an Argentine girl group called Chaos, or Chaos in Spanish, K4OS as it's rendered, because there are 4 members. So Chaos, which despite all of its members being from Argentina and singing in Spanish, they, in every visual and sonic sense, perform K-pop. This music, it couldn't be anything but K-pop. And just a few days ago, they even put up a video shot in the offices of Samsung to really hit that connection home. Whether Chaos will ever be able to mobilize an army of fans in the manner of a BTS, another phenomenon key to the perpetuation of Hallyu, the mobilizability of a huge fan base, only time will tell.
Yeah, it's just fascinating how far Hallyu has come, how international it's become. It's not just something that Koreans make, but it's the fact that the wider world has adopted Korean culture in their own way as well.
They have their own forms of Hallyu, adapted to their own cultures. And, with this new edition of The Birth of Korean Cool, Hong does revel a bit in how the years since the first edition have proved her right and the doubters wrong about the potential of Korea. This country, by the way, with which she, like so many self-described westernized Koreans, can have a conflicted relationship, the potential to become one of the world's foremost pop culture powers. But She also admits that she herself underestimated just how much impact Korea could make on her other homeland, the United States of America. Now, I admit Americans do tend to get bored quickly with things, of course, and what fascination they now have with things Korean could potentially dry up as suddenly as it arose. But I seriously doubt that Euny Hong's publisher is going to rule out the idea of a third edition of The Birth of Korean Cool.
No, indeed. I mean, Hallyu has been doubted before, as this book has noted. When the first book came out, I'm sure many will have been sceptical about the lasting impact of Korean Cool as such. So really, who knows how far it can go? But yes, this book, this expanded edition, it sounds like a worthy and perhaps actually necessary update to a book that was quite influential. Once again, it's called The Birth of Korean Cool by Euny Hong, the expanded 2025 edition, and that was our pick for this week's Korea Book Club. Colin, well, thank you for another thoughtful review. We're going to leave it there. It's been a pleasure as always, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.
See you next time. Thank you.
And that brings our show to a close. We'll be back tomorrow with updates on day 2 of the new Lee Jae-myung administration and more. Till then, we hope you have a great day. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-woo, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.